Good afternoon, and welcome to day 2 of Energy Finance 2021 online. I'm Sandy Buchanan, Executive Director of the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, coming to you today from Cleveland, Ohio. Our session today is entitled Coal in the U.S. Implications for Communities as the Pace of Closures Quickens. Before we get started, let me explain how our question and answer session will work. You'll see on the right-hand side of your screen a chat box. Feel free to place your questions in the chat and our moderator will relay those to the speaker. Also, you can use that chat box to interact with other employees. Excuse me, other attendees. I'd now like to introduce our moderator, Kate French. Kate is the Rocky Mountain Field Organizer for the Blue-Green Alliance, an organization which unites labor unions and environmental organizations to work on shared goals to create and maintain quality jobs and build a clean, thriving, and equitable economy. Kate has worked on these issues in the Rocky Mountain West since 2009 and has produced widely cited research on the potential for job creation and the economic impacts for coal ash pond closure, coal mine remediation, and coal community transition. Now let me turn this over to Kate to get us started.
Thank you so much. And welcome everyone to our panel, Coal in the U.S., Implications for Communities as the Pace of Closures Quickens. As Sandy mentioned, my name is Kate French. I'm with the Blue-Green Alliance, and I'll be moderating our panel today. Coal use has declined significantly over the last decade, and this shift away from coal-fired power is only expected to accelerate in the next 10 years. This will have big impacts for host communities in a number of ways: massive job losses, huge revenue cuts for local and state governments, ripple effects in other local industries, and the growing threat of abandoned coal waste sites. And these problems are only compounded for workers in frontline communities, often low income and/or communities of color that have already suffered from the negative impacts of air and water pollution for decades. Today, our panelists will discuss the data and analysis that leads us to this forecast of the coal industry, how local leaders in Illinois work to support impacted coal communities, and the takeaways for other state and federal decision makers. After the presentations, we will have time at the end for a moderated Q&A session. First, we will hear from Seth Feaster. Seth is an energy data analyst who has followed the coal industry and the U.S. power sector for IEEFA for 5 years, and he's based in New York. Prior to that, he had 25 years of experience creating visual presentations at the New York Times with a focus on energy, financial, and economic data. He has also worked in digital communications at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Next, we will hear from Celeste Flores. Celeste was born and raised in Lake County, Illinois. She began as a volunteer with Clean Power Lake County, working to develop a transition plan for the coal-fired plant in Waukegan along the shores of Lake Michigan. And her work with frontline community members has drawn national attention to the environmental injustices associated with corporate polluters in Lake County. As co-chair of Clean Power Lake County, Celeste has built strong relationships with various coalition partners and elected officials, and she has continually championed the need for environmental justice and frontline communities in the transition to an equitable, clean energy future. Most recently, in 2020, she was the guest of Senator Tammy Duckworth for the State of the Union address, and Celeste was also the recipient of the 2020 Energy News Network 40 Under 40 Awards. So, without further ado, we will start our presentations now.
I'm going to be talking today about the coal industry and what's happening with it in relation to the energy transition that's well underway in the United States. In 2020, the United States ran what amounted to a giant experiment in the electric power sector. As demand for electricity slumped during the economic contraction from the COVID pandemic, utilities across the country were forced to make a decision. What were the most expensive, least necessary sources of electric generation that they could cut back? And the answer, unequivocally, was coal-fired power. First, there was a collapse in market share. For the month of April 2020, in the depths of the pandemic lockdown, coal's market share in the electric sector fell to just 15%. For the year, coal's market share was below 20%, lower than both gas and nuclear power. That's half the level it was as recently as 2014, and far below the 50% share that it held for most of the 2000s. Second, most coal plants were run less than ever. Overall, U.S. coal plants ran at just 40% of their potential capacity, certainly the lowest in many years and possibly the lowest level ever. Third, the short-term impact of idling those coal plants across the country has turned into a significant long-term shift by utilities, a wave of new retirement announcements. As of March of last year, power companies had announced plans to shut about 37 gigawatts of coal generation capacity in the decade between 2021 and 2030. A little over a year later, as of this May, the amount of announced closures had doubled to more than 77 gigawatts, according to our research. Together, these changes revealed two things about the energy transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy that's underway in the US. First, the fundamental durability of the shift to wind and solar generation, which gained market share in this period, and that shift is now accelerating significantly. Before taking a closer look at how that transition is unfolding, I want to take a moment to explain why the energy consumption of the electric power sector matters so much and why IEEFA studies it so much. The power sector plays a pivotal role in the consumption of fossil fuels, especially coal in the United States. Of all the coal produced here, about 90% of it is consumed domestically. And of that domestic consumption, 90% is burned by utilities to produce electricity. For gas, the math isn't quite as stark, but the power sector is still the most significant player. Like coal, about 90% of dry gas produced in the US is consumed domestically in 2020. And while only 38% was used by power producers, that's still more than the 36% used by industry, the 15% used by residential consumers, and 10% used in the commercial sector. So let's turn back to how the energy transition is unfolding. In 2001, coal fueled more than half of the electricity generated by America's power sector, about 53%. The relationship was simple. Coal was electric power, and electric power was coal. Nuclear power only accounted for 21% of the market, gas for about 15%, and conventional hydropower was just 6%. Oil and diesel fuel still produce more than 3% of the electricity. Utility-scale solar and wind, only 0.2%. By the end of the decade, however, alternatives to coal were gaining. Coal's grip on the nation's utilities was still strong, but had started to slip to a market share of 46%. Several key disruptive technologies were emerging. The efficiency and size of industrial-scale wind turbines was growing quickly, and costs were falling. Costs were falling even faster for solar panels. By 2010, utility-scale solar and wind accounted for 2.4% of power sector generation. Meanwhile, in the petroleum sector, the ability of producers to unlock gas and oil from shale rock using horizontal drilling, a process called fracking, was shaking up that industry, driving down the cost of gas and helping it to capture nearly 23% of the power market. For context, in 2010, Apple was introducing the iPhone 4, and Tesla was delivering its 1,500th Roadster. In the parlance of those who study the adoption of new technologies, 2010 represents the end of the phase of the innovators, who were the first to figure out how to finance, build, and integrate the early wind and solar farms. They will be joined by more investors and developers for the next stage of growth. This bigger group of early adopters with more financial resources and more clout among utilities gave the energy transition tremendous momentum between 2011 and 2020, as wind and solar projects became bigger and more widespread. Notably, coal generation capacity would peak in 2011 at the beginning of that, and as the last of the new coal plants were coming online, and would give way to a wave of aging and uneconomic coal plants being pushed into retirement. Gas production boomed, pushing prices to record lows, and as a result, gas nearly doubled its market share to 39% by 2020, surpassing coal as the number one fuel for electricity in 2016. Utility scale solar and wind generation grew more than fourfold to over 11%. At the same time, public opinion and many state level policies began to shift in a meaningful way to ones less tilted in favor of fossil fuels and more in line with the changes sweeping through the market. The relationship between coal and the power industry had changed. Coal was still dependent on utilities, but utilities were no longer dependent on coal. Now, IEEFA believes that the energy transition has entered a new phase that will play out between now and 2030, one marked by a significant acceleration in wind and solar generation, supported by battery storage. Even though capacity has doubled from just 5 years ago to 173 gigawatts, that figure could soon double again, since another 84 gigawatts of wind, solar, and storage are already dominating construction and development queues across the country. Wind and utility scale solar are likely to pick up as much market share between this year and next as the entire decade from 2001 through 2010. With the economic of renewables no longer in dispute and a long proven record of grid performance, the majority of power producers, both big and small, are now emphasizing wind, solar, and storage development as integral to their long term plans. Growth is also being driven by more and more corporations actively seeking their own zero carbon power sources. This rapid expansion is having a bigger impact on power markets than it might have had in the past because the demand for electricity in the United States has plateaued, staying at about the same level it was in 2007. This is a major shift brought on by a combination of energy efficiency and a decoupling of economic growth from energy intensity. This no growth power market means that every new lower cost source of generation pushes out something more expensive, which today usually means older, inefficient coal and gas units. Here's what we think this means for the coming decade for coal. IEEFA is already seeing an accelerating pace of coal generation retirement scheduled for 2021 through 2030. As of late March last year, power companies had announced plans to shut about 37 gigawatts of coal generation capacity. By mid-May of this year, according to our tracking, the amount of announced closures had doubled to more than 77 gigawatts for the period from 2021 to 2030. On top of this, the rollout of climate impact and sustainability reports by big utilities in the past few months has led many of them to indicate that most or all of their coal fleets will retire by either 2035 or 2040. As more renewable power comes online, many of the coal plants that haven't yet retired will likely run less, relegated to a diminished role as seasonal backup. That's significant since half the decline in coal use in the US has come from plants running less, while the other half is from plants closing, according to an analysis by the Energy Information Administration. Last year, the nation's coal plants ran at only 40% of their capacity, probably the lowest level ever, despite the retirement of nearly 100 gigawatts, or nearly one-third of all coal capacity since 2011. As coal generation has fallen, so has coal production. In 2020, U.S. output fell by 165 million tons and has now fallen over 50% since its peak in 2008. This year, the Decker mine closed in the U.S.'s most productive coal region, the Powder River Basin. Another closure, the Coal Creek mine, is now set for next year. And the second most productive mine in the country, Black Thunder, is in the process of being wound down by its owner. That owner, Arch Resources, recently took the word coal out of its name and now describes its thermal coal mines, the ones that ship coal to the power sector, as legacy assets. This year and next, coal mining will likely stabilize following a rebound in power demand and higher prices for gas. But with the renewable generation growth and nearly 200 coal unit retirements already scheduled between now and 2030, there will be no avoiding falling demand. Over the past decade, this pattern of brief stabilization before another sharp downturn has been repeated several times, and the factors are already in place for it to happen again. However, as the coal market shrinks, economies of scale dwindle, and already weak financial returns vanish, A new wave of industry restructuring could be looming, this time with more permanent mine closures, job losses, and corporate disappearances than in the past. For nearly every community across the country still dependent on coal-fired power plants or the coal mines that supply them, the question is no longer if they will close, but whether they will close before 2030 or 2035, and how prepared the communities will be when that happens. Illinois is a good example to see how quickly the shift away from coal power has taken place. In 2008, coal generation peaked in the state with a market share of 48%. Wind and gas both had less than a 2% share. But growing wind and gas generation combined with falling overall electricity demand pushed coal's share to just 17% in 2020. Out of 26 coal plants in the state, a dozen have been fully retired, 2 partially retired, and 3 others converted to gas. By 2027, 6 more will be fully retired, leaving only 4 with any significant coal capacity. And each of those 4 have significant non-competitive market reasons, some of which may not last, that have so far allowed them to continue operating. These changes in Illinois reflect just how quickly the economics of electricity markets in the United States have been transformed and how those changes are accelerating as a result of these disruptive technologies. In this new era, many coal assets have become aging, inflexible, or simply money-losing burdens for utilities. More and more power companies are now implementing plans that completely end their use of coal. And as they do, the end of the coal era is coming into sharper focus. Thank you.
We are working to ensure clean air, clean water, and healthy soil for every Lake County community member and to achieve the self-determination of those disproportionately impacted by environmental pollution. We have been advocating since 2013 to secure a long-term transition plan for the Waukegan coal plant, which is the largest source of air and water pollution in Lake County. This plant, which Waukegan residents want to see retired, stands in the way of lakefront redevelopment. This generation station is one of the oldest in the state and the country. The question is not if the coal plant will retire, but when. The people of Waukegan want the city to develop a plan for community revitalization that recognizes the need to move away from this fossil fuel. We want to make sure that there's a plan that also provides a transition for the workers and holds the plant owners responsible for the cleanup of all the toxic waste on the sites. Community members since 2013 have started becoming experts on coal plants, on coal ash, and so many more issues. And we realize that we are living and working in an environmental justice community, something that I did not know growing up. I did not come to learn about any of this until after my undergrad and when I started volunteering with Clean Power Lake County. The current owner of the Waukegan coal plant is NRG Energy, one of the top 3 carbon emitters in the country. NRG has done the bare minimum to comply with the current environmental regulations. This facility has never been issued an operating permit in compliance with the Clean Air Act Amendment of 1990. Even with the low-grade pollution controls that have been added, the Waukegan coal plant continues to be the largest emitter of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, and lead in Lake County. Waukegan is a majority-minority community. Black, brown, people of color have historically been vulnerable to health problems and disproportionately lack access to quality health care. They directly experience the effects of the pollution, which can be measured in emergency room visits, work and school days lost due to the illness. 1 in 3 children in Waukegan have asthma or asthma-like symptoms, well above the national average. Waukegan is also home to 5 Superfund sites. In Illinois, we have 11, and 5 are situated in Waukegan. Polluting industries have called Waukegan home for generations. Our community members know the costs associated with abrupt closures and departure of industries, and they know the city can't afford another toxic site. Unfortunately, our story is not unique, and we see it across the nation, but we see it here in the state of Illinois. There has been one announcement after another of coal plants retiring without a plan and without notice. We have seen job losses. We have known family members, community members lose their job a day before Christmas. And this is not the future we want. This is not the uncertainty we want. We want to make sure that we're holding these corporate polluters accountable and that there is a plan. And here with Clean Power Lake County, we were doing a lot of advocacy at the local level, getting our mayors to know about the issue, our aldermen to know about the issue. And we realized while working for the Future Energy Jobs Act, which became law in 2016, that we really needed to start focusing on state policy. It wasn't enough to just work on retiring the coal plant in Waukegan, but we wanted to secure a just transition for all of the communities in Illinois. And one of those ways was by becoming a member of the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition in 2017. And that year, we started brainstorming, asking ourselves, what is the next climate and energy bill? How are we going to move Illinois towards 100% renewable energy? And we advocated to go out to the community, ask the community the questions we were asking ourselves in that room to get their input, because we knew as CPLC that the community had the answers we needed and were looking for. And so across the state, with the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition, we held over 100 community dialogues here in Lake County. Clean Power Lake County, Sierra Club, and other organizations held these listening sessions in Waukegan, in Zion, and other parts of the community. And the message was clear. Community members wanted polluters to pay. They wanted polluters to be held responsible for the cleanup and everything that came with a just transition. And that's when we started asking more questions and started creating programs and also looking at other state policies. And that's when we created the Clean Energy Jobs Act and created this policy that we're trying to become law. And it's really exciting for me personally because it's really centering those voices that are not centered. It is community driven. We listened to the community and then worked with experts to create these laws and create these new policies. And one that I'm particularly really excited about, because we're trying to decarbonize our whole carbon sector in Illinois, is that CEJA will create clean energy empowerment zones throughout the state. These will offer tax breaks and other support for new clean energy businesses in the area where coal plants have recently closed or may close in the future. Waukegan is slated to become a clean energy empowerment zone and a clean jobs workforce hub. This means that we'll be getting funding, training resources, and guidance to revitalize the Waukegan coal plant sites. And none of this would be possible without all of those community members coming together and giving us what we need, and for us to be able to go to the state, go to our lawmakers and give them this policy and tell them that they need to pass this. We have been advocating and working for this for 2 years now, and it looks like this summer may be the summer that CEJA, the Cleaner Jobs Act, becomes a bill. We are working with the governor's office and lawmakers to pass a climate and energy bill that is the most aggressive and most progressive bill in the nation. And that will get us to what we want. We will be able to go to community members and tell them that there is a plan for this coal plant. Tell them that there is a plan to transition away and for jobs to come our way. So I just wanted to share some of the pictures of community members that have been doing this work on the ground. None of this would be possible without them and all their hours of work, and really having them be the ones that lead the way. And really excited in Waukegan to see how state policy is going to directly impact us and impact the rest of the state. So looking forward to having this bill passed and working on other legislation to make sure that we all have access to clean air, clean water, and healthy soil.
All right, welcome back, everyone. We will now have time for a moderated Q&A session until the top of the hour. And so if you can put your questions into the chat, we'll try to get to as many as we can in the allotted time. But to start, to kick it off, we do have Seth with us and we have Celeste. The first question is for Seth. And Seth, do you think that the coal companies benefit from a forecast of a slower decline of the coal industry's future? And if so, how do you think this negatively impacts workers and communities?
So there's been a lot of talk recently because of a rebound or a recovery in the coal industry. EIA is forecasting about 600 million tons of production for this year and next. Bloomberg just ran a story about how big an improvement that is, but I want to remind everybody that that is still about 100 million tons less than 2019. And in the past, when coal production has recovered slightly from big downturns like we had in 2020, it doesn't last very long, and then it starts its inevitable march downward again. So the danger of coal companies' optimistic forecasts, as in the past, is that it's really misleading for communities and workers. They get a sense of hope and optimism that coal is going to come back. And inevitably, as we've seen time and time again, plants continue closing, mines continue closing, and the downsizing of the industry starts to pick up pace relatively quickly. And we can see that we expect that that's going to happen again before too long, because the pace of retirements is increasing. The utilities are continuing to accelerate retirements, and we think that that is set to go on to accelerate. And so a lot of these plants, a lot of the mines are going to start closing within the next decade.
Great, thank you. The next question here is for Celeste. And Celeste, you mentioned the importance of cleanup for local communities. Can you talk about why holding companies responsible for the full site cleanup was so important to the communities that you talked to, and to the workers and to the state decision makers?
Yeah, hey. I think it's really important because this is, for most of us, where we work and live, right? There's a lot of workers in the Waukegan coal plant that don't live in the area, so they're commuters. But I think for the community members that have, born and raised here and have seen the lakefront, they imagine a lakefront without that coal plant. And one of the ways of doing that is to have a plan. So I think it's really important to listen to the community because they're the ones that are here day in and day out. We know these companies, their main headquarters are in Texas. They don't have any local roots. They might have some lobbyists, right, in like the Capitol or some other places. But it's just so important for the community to know the future of their own town and the growth that they hope to gain. So that's why we push so much for that, to be able to plan ahead, and not just leave it to chance as to what happens to that area, because we've seen that with the Superfund sites. We have 5 out of 11 Superfund sites in the state of Illinois are based in Waukegan, and that's been because of advocacy, right? I'm sure there's plenty of sites in Chicago that should be considered Superfund sites that should be being cleaned up by the federal EPA, but it hasn't. We've been able to do that lobbying up here and make sure that that cleanup happens. And we need to make sure that same thing happens with coal plants across the state.
Thanks. So Karen Harris from the Tortuga Foundation, she asks, if electricity demand grows to electrify transportation and possibly heating, where do you see the supply coming from? And 2, and I think these questions are both for Seth, how much impact does local distributed solar generation have on supply and demand? Seth?
Let me address the first one. So one of the most significant trends, as I discussed in my presentation, is that electricity demand has not risen for a decade. And this is causing utilities across the country, which have constantly projected growth, to constantly revise their forecasts downward. And it makes some utilities have said they need to build new gas in order to produce electricity to meet that demand growth, but it's never materialized in the past 10 years. And so it's actually helped stop quite a number of gas plants because the growth isn't there. Now, when is that growth likely to show up? It's very unclear. Clearly, electric vehicles are going to rise quickly as the sales rise, and demand will rise somewhat with that. But I think that the solutions that are coming may mitigate that demand growth considerably. And so I think I'm taking the point of view that we need to be very cautious about forecasting some big ramp up in the demand for electricity and have utilities use that as an excuse to build out more gas plants. At the same time, it will at some point become an issue if it does grow quickly. However, I want to point out that, this sort of addresses the second question about community solar and residential solar. That has been growing very quickly too. I don't talk about that in my presentation very much, but we think that it has soaked up a considerable amount of whatever growth was left. And electric vehicles, since they can be charged at home, may benefit a great deal from residential solar, community solar, and sort of commercial solar at like parking lots, places like that, where you can charge a vehicle during the day or overnight. So I would take a wait and see approach before we start talking about a big ramp up in demand.
All right, thank you. Celeste, this next question is for you. This is from Zane Gustafsson from the Sightline Institute. I hope I pronounced his last name correctly. And the question for you, Celeste, is what advice do you have regarding crafting just transition policy for other parts of the country following your lead?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot. One is having to educate yourself and your community first, right? Being your advocates and becoming those experts in these things, right? Energy market, capacity market, greenhouse initiatives, all of these terms are things that I had no idea existed in 2013, 2014, when our group started here in Waukegan. And we went from trying to talk to our local mayor to now advocating at the state level with a lot of other organizations, and our fight's still not done, right? We have been building power. So I think that's the second thing, is once you're out in the community, empowering them to know that they can make that difference and they can be in that room with other policymakers, with people that maybe have their masters in these things. But as community members, I always say we have a master's in being able to speak for our community and knowing what our needs are. And fighting to be in those rooms. I think I had not imagined that I would be doing this type of work. And I found myself doing it. And now I still do this as a volunteer and, work on immigration issues for my full-time job. But I think, having the community and being able to be in those rooms, joining those coalitions and reading, right? What is that legislation that other states are passing? We're trying to pass legislation and we've gotten one hurdle after the other. There's a lot of people in Springfield right now trying to pass this legislation that I spoke about. We don't know if that's going to happen or not. But looking at those programs, right, and seeing if they've been implemented and making sure you're keeping track of what other states are doing to be able to bring that to your state and building that power, because unions, corporations, utility companies, they all have power and influence, and we have the people power, and we need to use that to win over the money power.
Thank you. Appreciate that. So, Seth, this next question is for you. This is from Patrick Bacon at RF Technologies. And he asks, In the US, what economic approaches have been most effective in working with utilities to transition from stranded coal power plant assets?
It's a great question. And without getting too deeply into electricity market design here, because there have been a lot of different approaches in this country. Every place from ERCOT, which obviously had its problems in February, to PJM, which has issues with its capacity market structure. But one of the most interesting overarching things that's happening, and this really speaks directly to what Celeste is working on, is that over the last 4 or 5 years or so, a lot of the approaches driven by state policy have been among the most effective at the state level in order to push for change. So we're not talking really about a federal level. We're not talking about the grid operator level. We're talking about the state level. And that has really pushed a lot of utilities to start to address what they're going to do. At the same time, we see a lot of pressure on both the coal industry and to some extent now utilities by forcing them to address their pollution, their carbon pollution. They're now having to think much more about this in the boardroom. And honestly, over the last 6 months or so, as some of the bigger utilities have come out with their net zero or climate sustainability statements and outlooks, we think that has really driven some sea change in the boardroom, at the boardroom level, in terms of having to address the reality of closing coal plants, especially some of the big coal plants in places like West Virginia and Tennessee. I'm thinking TVA and American Electric Power here. And so we've really seen some of these initiatives force a change of thinking at the highest levels of utilities, and that is going to bring about a much faster retirement schedule in a lot of these coal plants.
All right. There's another question for you here, Seth. This is from Glenn Hooks from the Arkansas Sierra Club, who writes, as U.S. coal plants fade and coal production lessens, is it likely that the U.S. coal industry survives by exporting to other parts of the world? And what are the barriers to keep that from happening, if true?
So the coal industry has touted exports forever as the answer to their problems. But there's been tremendous work by activists on the West Coast that stopped a number of major exporting projects to Asia. That has really closed the door, I think, on that area of exports. And so the other thing is that, keep in mind, the rest of the world, for the most part, is headed in the same direction, maybe a little bit slower, a little bit later than the United States, but certainly Europe, where a lot of exports in the past have gone, is really ramping up its the wind down of the coal industry, the coal sector. So exports, a few years ago, there was all this talk that exports were the answer. That hasn't materialized. Coal prices plunged, and so did coal exports last year. They've been going down for a couple of years. They're not really going to recover much. And what's happened is a lot of coal companies have now switched to saying that met coal, which is used in steel making, is the new answer. So, there may be some recovery in exports, but it is certainly not a viable answer for very much coal leaving the country for the future.
Gotcha. All right, this next question is for Celeste. And Celeste, from your experience, why do you think the timing of plant retirement announcements matters so much to workers and communities? And do you think legislation is needed to ensure adequate advance warning is provided to a community? If so, why?
Yeah, I definitely think it's needed. We've seen it here in Illinois where workers and the community are not given enough notice. I forget which plan it was, but people were laid off the day before Christmas, right? I mean, people have to make, people make plans. A lot of, unfortunately, we saw this with COVID. A lot of the typical community member lives paycheck to paycheck. There's not a lot in the savings accounts. So when you suddenly lose your job, and if you may be the only breadwinner, that really affects you. So I think for community members and for our government's sake, the tax base and everything else, it's about, as an employee, the courtesy to give a 2-week notice. And even then, I know organizations can really scramble, right? 2 weeks is not enough to find someone else and get them to replace the work that's being done. So the same thing goes with workers, right? They should know that this is coming, or being able to find something else, because we rely on these, a lot of these communities can rely on these jobs. We're fortunate here in Waukegan that it's not a big employer of our community. We have other factories that are, and we saw that with COVID. We have a company here that was doing around the clock testing for COVID. And all of a sudden, all of that started winding down, and employees found themselves without a job. They had a job for 15 months, right? That was steady, that was, hourly, and they came back to the warehouse the next day, and there was a notice, right, that there was no longer a job for those people. So what are those people going to do? So that's why I think legislation is one of the only ways. We can talk to corporations and say they're going to give a heads up, but at the end of the day, they don't owe us anything legally. They're not binded to tell the company, to tell the employees, to tell the government, to tell the community what their next steps are. I mean, maybe if you're a shareholder, you'll get some insight, but when we look at how can we hold them accountable, it has to be through a legal way, which is through legislation. And that's what we're trying to do in the state of Illinois, is really trying to set those dates to move the state away from be fossil free, and then eventually also phase out natural gas. And we're trying to write that in the legislation, and it's not an easy hurdle. People don't like to do that, but we're pushing for it.
Definitely. Thank you. Seth, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. One is that the more clarity the communities can get over when plants and mines are going to close, the more they can plan, and that's really critical for their future. Celeste is exactly right on that. And in Illinois, it's a bit of a mixed bag. There have been sudden closures. There were a number of Vistor plants that suddenly closed about a year ago, I think, year and a half ago. But there are now also a number of plants where we know when they're going to close in Illinois. They have sort of scheduled for the next few years when those plants are going to close. However, utilities have done this thing where they are saying that the plant is going to close, like the Joppa Steam plant in Southern Illinois. They announced last year that it's going to close in 2027, and 6 months later they say, oh no, it's going to close in 2022. So that's happening over and over again all over the country, that they put in a date, but then they accelerate it often by a year to 5 years or more. And so you can get plant closures that are just months away all of a sudden. Now, I also want to say, though, that in terms of labor, the utilities have been, I don't want to get all warm and fuzzy on utilities here, but the utilities in general have been a little bit better about labor and keeping labor within the company rather than laying everybody off all at once. You can probably keep your retirement and your pension and some of your medical benefits. The utilities tend to have money, and they tend to have more oversight by the states. Mining companies have done a terrible job. So both the plant and the mining stuff is relevant for Illinois. So you have sudden closures, you have bankruptcies in the mining industry where labor gets completely shut out of the bankruptcy process, and they not only lose their jobs, they lose their medical benefits for retirees. And that is really damaging for communities, because not only are you losing jobs, you're losing 10 or 20 or 30 years worth of those benefits that would have stayed in that community. So it's really damaging for the long term to those communities to lose the pension money and the retirement money. And unfortunately, the coal mining industry has a terrible, terrible record on that. So it's there's a mix of outcomes there.
And Seth, do you think that there is a legislative fix to that issue of that you just mentioned, of coal communities or coal mining companies just throwing away their obligations or walking away from their obligations to workers?
You know, there's some legislation. There's the O'Halloran legislation in Congress. There has been some legislation at the state level that's tried to address this. I think in some ways, the best possible thing is like what the kind of work that Celeste is talking about here is getting some kind of advance warning, some kind of schedule for communities to know when these things are going to happen. I mean, the first battle that we had to fight here was getting communities to even admit that it's not if they're going to close, it's when they're going to close. And that's true of the Waukegan plant and basically all the coal plants in the country, even Prairie State. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And so for communities and counties and states, in order to do better fiscal planning, and that because there's a lot of tax implications, there's a lot of income impacts on workers and communities, having some dates of when this is going to happen, having a clear sense of a wind down is really important. But various states have had a really mixed record on this because some states have really stuck their head in the sand. And I'm thinking here of West Virginia and Wyoming and North Dakota a little bit, because they're all trying to save the coal industry while at the same time not really doing much to help workers. And that is actually in places where we've seen this kind of effort to try and hold off this energy transition by trying to force the coal plants to stay open or the mines to stay open, it's actually had a really negative impact because they spend a lot of time and energy in these states trying to keep the plants and mines open, but they're wasting that time when they could have better spent it planning and for that transition. And so what ends up happening is the transition is much tougher, much quicker, and much more sweeping when it does arrive, as it almost inevitably does. And utilities are part of that process because when the legislation or the efforts to keep the stuff open fail and the utilities feel free to close the plant or the mining companies just shut down the mine, it happens very suddenly. So there's very little warning for communities. The more they can do to plan for this stuff, the better off they're going to be.
Do you think that that is then reason for a federal legislative approach or a federal policy approach to have a more uniform process of transition or laws that would help to govern a more orderly transition between states?
Yeah, I think that Celeste can probably address this too, because that's the motivation for doing the legislation that she's working on. I think Celeste can address that. But that kind of bill in Illinois provides a roadmap for companies, for utilities, for mining companies, for everybody, and community, especially the communities and the workers, in order to say, okay, this is what's going to happen. Now, how do we address it? So I don't know, but I think that I don't know exactly what's in the legislation she's working on, and she should speak to that. But I hope that that's the kind of template that we're going to get in more states. I think we're seeing it in some other states. We're seeing it in Illinois. We're seeing it maybe in New Mexico and Arizona to some extent, maybe New York. But yeah, so Celeste, what would you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously every community, every state is unique, but having some kind of federally always helps, especially I think there's a lot of hope with Biden and Harris's administration, EPA. I think for us here in the state of Illinois, we just saw how important it was to have those different avenues for workers, right? Because, you are working, you've been working your whole life in this industry and you are expected to be getting paid so much. So is there the opportunity for early retirement? Is there the opportunity for going back and being retrained in something else, or, being transferred somewhere. And, those are all things that were in this legislation, right? Working to make sure there's different pathways for the workers, that there's a transition for them, that it's not about them just being left behind, or being forced into early retirement that maybe wouldn't be great for their benefits if they had stayed a couple more years. And then also for the communities, right? It's about reinvesting in these communities, and it's about bringing those solar jobs, energy efficiency, right? I think something that's completely overlooked a lot of the times, right? There's a lot of jobs in that as well. And then what are the realities for wind in different states, right? What's that reality for us here in Illinois? And we're trying to make those investments and really work with labor and unions that have not historically been places where Black and Brown women can thrive, right? How can we actually get people to go through this process, but also make it a place where anyone can thrive, regardless of who they are? And those are the things we're pushing for. Those are the things that we're trying to change. We're trying to create a new culture, while still being within some of these systems. Like, how can we start changing years of work, of mentality? And I think federally we need to see what can we push, right? I think this was needed 10, 20 years ago, and there's a big movement now to address climate change, but really that's what we need to make sure is that we're addressing that, and that's not something we're negotiating out, because we also can see that a lot of the times. Prairie State is the largest polluter in the state of Illinois and the 7th in the nation. And they know it's a matter of time, and they want to stay open as much as possible, because there's a profit there. The reason there's a coal plant here in Waukegan, Illinois, is because of the PJM market and because there's a profit. I don't know if that's going to be the case in 3 years or not. I haven't been able to do all of the research. I know that they just had an auction, and numbers were lower than normal, but as long as companies continue to profit, they're going to profit, regardless of where the community's at. And that's, for us, it's not just about addressing the pollution of the coal plant, but it's cumulative impact. We have ethylene oxide being emitted into our air, which is a class 1 carcinogen. So I think it's we need to look at it a lot more holistically, than just retiring these coal plants. But you also have to take it one step at a time. Like, how do we look at energy? How do we look at solar? What are we moving towards? And how are we building up those infrastructures? Because we know we can't just turn off every fossil fuel today, but we do know, because we've done research, that if the coal plant in Waukegan were to be turned off today, that would be my worst nightmare. But we would continue to have all the energy we need, right, for our region. If we don't depend on this, we don't depend on this coal plant. But as a community member, I also want to make sure that we have a plan. So we need to see if we can address something federally that addresses all of these nuances, because every community is different. But it would be great to be able to push some of those states that maybe are just trying to pretend that they don't live in this reality, that we are moving towards renewable energy, and giving that incentive and that push, right? Because maybe they also need reinvestments and don't know how to find that. Since they, for years, I lived in Kentucky, I lived in Eastern Kentucky. I saw the devastation of mountaintop removal. And it was years after those companies left, and those families are still grappling with the fact that that company left. And I was like, that was decades ago. So we know we need to invest in all of our communities. And if we could do something federally, that would be amazing.
Thank you so much. And I would like to lift up one of the examples of states tackling this is also Colorado, with their formation of the Just Transition Office just a couple of years ago. So a lot of lessons to learn there, and also the role that the federal government can play, that, things that states can't do on their own. So I'd also like to pitch, I think, this question to Seth, although you both might have feelings on it that you'd like to share. But Paul Goff, apologies, from the Pittsburgh Business Times asks, A lot of talk here in Pennsylvania about the state joining the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, the RGGI, and the impact of the coal industry if the state does join the other Northeast states. What does this mean for the coal industry? And also 2 closures announced last week that I've reported on, the closing of the Cheswick Generating Station near Pittsburgh and the Blacksville number 2 mine in West Virginia is happening, whether the state goes into the RGGI or not. What's the impact of the market versus joining RGGI?
That's an interesting question. It's a little tough to answer because the Greenhouse Gas Initiative is probably not the primary driver of that's going to have the impact on the coal industry in Pennsylvania, because Pennsylvania is part of the PJM electric market, and that probably has a bigger impact. However, the closure of Cheswick and the closure of the Blacksville mine complex is very telling about how this transition is happening with or without policies in place like RGGI, whether or not the state is going to join that. A lot of these changes are being driven by utilities and the demand for coal, which is continuing to decline. And so you're going to have this, constant drumbeat in places like Pennsylvania where these mines and these plants are closing. Along with Cheswick, there were two other plants, one in Maryland, I forget the third, that also are closing. And those plants are representative of how the transition is happening. They're being used less and less and less, and finally it becomes kind of untenable for them to economically to keep them open. However, the announcements are relatively near term, and so they're going to have an impact on the communities without a huge amount of warning for some of them. The Blacksville mine is going to be closing this summer. So there's not a whole lot of lead time here on this stuff, but it doesn't, the transition in the coal industry is happening whether or not you have a state like Pennsylvania joining the Greenhouse Gas Initiative. It's all about the economics in the market, really.
Yeah, real quick, I think something that's really important a lot for environmental justice communities is how these coal plants are closed, right? And I think that's something that in the state of Illinois, we really have been grappling with, because we still have plenty of coal plants, even though we've had plenty of announcements and plenty that have retired since I started doing this work. But, it's been the coal plants that are the newest, the, quote unquote, cleaner ones, the ones that have more of the state of the art utilities to help clean the air and everything else, that have either retired or announced to retire first, right? It's not the ones where Black and brown folks are. It's not the ones where low income folks are living. So really this greenhouse initiative, I know I've looked into it and I've had other friends that live in those states that have it tell us about the inequalities, right? Of how this is happening, of, putting a price on carbon and being able to trade that, because it ends up being this thing that you can do on your computer, right? But you don't see the effects of the community. 1 in 3 children in Waukegan have asthma or asthma-like symptoms, right? Those are not variables that are being put in to these formulas as well when they're looking at this. So really the importance of looking at, everything that's happening in that community and being able to prioritize retiring those coal plants that are the worst polluters. And that's not something that we've seen happen through that initiative, unfortunately, from the experience that other people have shared with me.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your answers here. We are going to wrap up the Q&A session here. If your question didn't get answered, we will try to be in contact with you to address these specifically as well. But I want to thank our panelists again for this insightful discussion. And I would like to thank everyone who attended for submitting your questions and for participating today. And with that, we will conclude this panel. Thanks so much.
Great. And Thank you so much. Let me add my own gratitude to Celeste and Seth and Kate for this very interesting discussion on both the challenges and opportunities that are facing communities that are being hit as plants and mines close. We hope that you'll be able to stay on here for about 10 more minutes and watch the first in our series of videos called Local Leadership Global Change. This first video highlights the remarkable work being done to accelerate the energy transition in the Philippines. We hope you'll also be right back here tomorrow at the same time for our next session on the weakening case for U.S. liquefied natural gas exports. And also, please feel free to join any of the side meetings that you see listed on the agenda. Thanks again, everybody, and goodbye.
I'm Lidi Nakpil. I'm the coordinator of the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development and also the convener of the Asia Energy Network.
I'm Red Constantino. I'm with the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities. We work on fair climate policy and low carbon development. We're based in Manila, but we also work with governments in Africa, Latin America, and Asia.
I'm Sarah Jane Ahmed. I'm a finance advisor to the vulnerable group of 20 ministers of finance of the Climate Vulnerable Forum. It's a group of 48 climate vulnerable developing countries focused on enhancing climate action. The Philippines is in the top 10 of all climate vulnerability rankings.
One of our big campaigns is the campaign to end fossil fuels and make the swift transition to democratic and renewable energy systems. We're campaigning against coal not just for its immediate polluting effects on communities, but also because its huge contribution to climate change. I started out as an activist fighting the dictator in the 1980s, but at that time, we thought that, well, environmental issues are not as urgent as the fight for our lives and our survival under a dictatorship. But we were wrong. I acknowledge many years later because with stopping climate change, there is only a window of time that we have to do decisive action. For years, we have been battling against this mantra of government and energy producers saying that coal is our main option because it's cheap and we are a developing country. We need to have cheap energy, that there's urgency in bringing electricity to people. You know, all those many years of campaigning are bearing fruits. We finally got the Department of Energy to declare a moratorium on new coal projects. It's a temporary suspension, it's not a permanent ban, so it's not like we can be complacent about it. We've also gotten a few banks to say that they're no longer going to fund new coal projects because of the local resistance and the national campaigns of various groups. There have been at least 19 coal power plants in the pipeline that have been stalled or delayed for the last 3 to 4 years. We've also gotten the support of bishops of the Catholic Church that have explicitly called for the phase out of coal power. So, you know, we're quite happy that we have reached this point.
To be climate vulnerable would be that you are disproportionately impacted by climate change. So if you're a small island developing state or in South Asia, Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, you are more impacted, which means you see more extreme weather events. You are susceptible to higher risk due to sea level rise, in addition to other concerns such as being a developing country.
We're 7,000 islands bordering the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. And we're so vulnerable to typhoons and extreme weather events. Now, they're more frequent and they're super typhoons, very strong ones.
We need to also understand, however, that vulnerability is not just equated, should not be equated with disasters. There's also such a thing as slow onset climate events that take place without the drama of calamity, but which actually punish local economies even more. Rising sea levels, changes in hydrology, less rainfall here, more rainfall there. Punishment in the long term for economies that rely on agriculture and predictable seasons. The country imports most of its fossil fuels. It depends on importations of coal, around 80% of which comes from Indonesia. And so when we talk about the energy transition, it encompasses several facets of development. Energy security is central, obviously, because we should be relying on our own sources of power rather than importing fuel from abroad. At the same time, we want to modernize our sector because we want to be able to consume power where it's produced, and a large part of the population are so isolated. The question is it better to connect them to the main grid or to establish decentralized distributed renewable energy systems? I favor more that small islands actually are independent of the main grid, because then they can enjoy their own power. Renewable energy is actually going to work best for them. So wind and solar, hydro, geothermal are all going to be really critical to the country's energy future and the country's ultimate development trajectory. We need to bake the climate crisis into the long-term development strategies of developing countries.
In a time of transition, this is where the old technologies try to find relevance, the new technologies try to enter. So this is where we are now. It's a tug of war of what technology mix will one choose and will one go with.
The debate has yet to be won in terms of fossil gas, because government understandably is seeing fossil gas as an opportunity to bring in cleaner energy compared to coal. But I think because there will be elections next year where a new administration will be coming in, we are confident that we are going to be able to convince government that if they consider natural gas or fossil gas as a bridge fuel, they need to spell out where does that end.
The transition that we're discussing today should be within this decade. And that's the issue with gas right now, is that there's no contract that is less than 10 years. There's no contract that's just, 2021 to 2030. The contracts are 20, 25 years or longer. And that's not necessarily a transition. That's a lock-in.
What is killing coal right now is also going to kill gas in the near future.
Southeast Asia and South Asia are growth markets. They're developing. And the potential for manufacturing, service, exports, all of this is huge. And to remain competitive in trade and output, we need low-cost power. And unfortunately, gas is just expensive, it's volatile, it doesn't offer that opportunity for countries to be cost competitive. Looking at that perspective, gas doesn't make sense, but the reason it's being pushed is because the US has a glut in supply. Japan has an entire logistics chain that supports gas. Australia also trying to offload gas. There are a lot of folks that have invested in gas and they're looking to sell it somewhere and they're unable to sell it in their markets. So what happens, as they did with coal, they look at developing countries.
One of the great injustices of this is that developing countries have contributed the least to greenhouse gas emissions, but we take on the brunt of the impacts of climate change. And that's something that we always need to reiterate. We're not largely responsible for this. The rich are, and they have a responsibility to address the impacts for a problem that they created. One of the things that we're working on is the mobilization and delivery of climate finance. It's part of the international obligations of parties to the climate convention. We use every arena we can participate and engage in, from the streets to the corridors of international negotiations, to raise this issue. On the one hand, you're stopping climate change. On the other hand, you have to enable people and communities to deal with the already present impacts. And how do you balance that? I'm often asked what should be prioritized, and I said I don't think we have the luxury of deciding which is priority. We have to do both.
I am quite confident that the country will end up in the right landing zone where renewable energy will be the dominant power generation in the mix. The challenge is answering this big question: can we arrive sooner? Can we shave off 5, 7, 10 years from long campaigns so that people will gain the benefits sooner and we can avoid harm to tens of thousands in a quicker way? Look, I'm in an institute that believes that we can change the world. And some people will call that a delusion. I would say that if I wasn't doing something that would change the world in my mind, I ask the big question: what's the point?
As campaigners, we have to be optimistic. I mean, it's our business to try and do the impossible. In my experience, in my life experiences, we brought down dictators. So if we can do that, we can do anything because we faced quite a lot in that process. The realism that we need to have is to recognize that our opponents are not going to give up without a real fight. So you need to really build your power and use that power in order to compel them. That's our contribution to the fight, to build that power of people for collective action.